Somewhere in the ancient world there was an empire so vast, so organized, and so quietly powerful that when it disappeared it did not leave behind a single dramatic ending. No final battle carved into stone, no great fire remembered in stories, no clear moment when everything fell apart. Instead, it simply faded. And what makes this even more curious is that this empire was not small, not weak, and not forgotten in its own time. It was known. It was respected. It was deeply connected to the lives of thousands, perhaps millions of people. And yet today, it feels like a shadow, a quiet presence in history that we can sense but never fully see. Now gently let us step into this mystery together. Welcome. Tonight we are not rushing through history. We are not chasing dates or memorizing names. Instead, we are walking slowly through the remains of something that once felt permanent. This is the story of a silent empire, an empire that did not collapse loudly, but disappeared quietly. And as we move through this story, we will ask a simple question. How can something so large vanish so completely? If we begin at the very start, we do not see an empire, we see land. Wide open land stretching farther than the eye can follow. There are rivers moving slowly through it, bringing life to the soil. There are small settlements, clusters of homes built from earth and wood. There are people living simple lives, farming, trading, building. Nothing here feels like the center of power. Nothing suggests that this place will one day become something vast. And yet, slowly, something begins to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift. The settlements begin to grow. Paths between villages become more traveled. Goods begin to move more frequently. Ideas begin to spread. And perhaps the most important change is something we cannot see directly. Organization. People begin to coordinate. They begin to plan. Not just for today, but for seasons ahead. Water is managed more carefully. Fields are arranged with intention. Structures are built with purpose. It is here in these small decisions that the first signs of an empire appear. Not in conquest, not in war, but in cooperation. As time passes slowly, these settlements begin to connect more deeply. Trade routes form. At first, they are simple. A path between two villages, a shared exchange of grain, tools, or pottery. But over time, these paths stretch farther, village to village, region to region, and something interesting begins to happen. The people who travel these routes begin to carry more than goods. They carry knowledge, a better way to build a wall, a more efficient method to grow crops, a new idea about how to organize a community. And as these ideas move, they begin to shape everything. Villages that once looked different begin to look similar. Structures follow similar patterns. Tools are made in similar ways. Even daily routines begin to align. It is almost as if an invisible thread is weaving them together. No single person is controlling this. No loud leader is declaring it. It is simply happening. And this is how the silent empire begins to take form. Now let us move a little deeper. If we could stand in one of these growing settlements, we might notice something else. Order, not strict or harsh, but present. There are spaces for living, spaces for working, spaces for storing food. Paths are not random anymore. They follow patterns. Water flows are directed, fields are divided carefully. And perhaps most interesting of all, there is evidence of planning. This is not a place that grew by accident, it was shaped. But by whom? This is where the mystery deepens, because unlike many other empires, there is no clear sign of kings, no massive palaces rising above everything else, no statues celebrating rulers, no grand tombs filled with treasures. Instead, everything feels balanced, equal in a quiet way. Homes are similar in size, public spaces are shared. It is as if the power of this empire was not held by one person, but by the system itself. This raises a quiet question. How do you build something so organized without a central figure of power? The answer may lie in something very simple: trust. If people trust the system, they follow it. If they believe it works, they maintain it. And over time, this creates stability. A kind of stability that does not depend on one leader, but on everyone. It is slow to build, but once it exists, it can be incredibly strong. As the empire continues to grow, its reach expands. New regions become connected. More people become part of this system, and with this growth comes complexity. More goods are produced, more resources are needed, and so the systems become more refined. Storage areas become larger, trade becomes more organized, crafts become more specialized. Some people focus only on pottery, others on tools, others on managing resources. This division of roles allows the society to become more efficient, and with efficiency comes prosperity. Food is stored for difficult seasons. Resources are used carefully. Waste is reduced. Everything begins to feel sustainable, balanced, almost as if the empire has found a rhythm. But this raises another gentle thought. If everything is working so well, what could possibly go wrong? And more importantly, if something does go wrong, how would we even notice? Because this empire does not leave behind loud records. No dramatic writings, no clear stories, only traces, quiet traces. Now imagine walking through one of these cities at its height. The air is calm. There is movement but not chaos. People go about their daily tasks, carrying water, working with tools, preparing food. There are no signs of panic, no signs of conflict. Everything feels steady. And yet, beneath this calm surface, small changes may already be beginning. Changes so subtle that no one notices them at first. As time passes slowly, the environment begins to shift. Perhaps the rivers do not flow as they once did. Maybe they become weaker or change direction. Water, which once supported everything, becomes less predictable. Fields that once produced plenty begin to struggle, not suddenly, just a little less each season, a little more uncertainty. And when a system is built on balance, even small disruptions matter. At first, the people adapt. They always have. They adjust their farming. They store more carefully. They share resources. The system bends, but it does not break. This is the strength of such an empire. It is flexible, quietly resilient. But as we move further into this story, we begin to wonder, what happens when the changes do not stop? What happens when the environment continues to shift? When the rivers no longer return to their old paths? When the land no longer responds the same way? This is where the silence becomes important, because unlike empires that fall with battles, this one leaves no clear moment of collapse. There is no single day when everything ends. Instead, there are many small moments: a family deciding to leave, a village slowly emptying, a trade route used less frequently. Each moment is small, almost unimportant on its own, but together they begin to reshape everything. And so, the empire does not fall. Thins, it stretches, it slowly dissolves. Now let us pause here for a moment, because what we are seeing is not a dramatic ending. It is something much quieter and perhaps much more mysterious. An empire that was built on cooperation, on balance, on shared systems, begins to fade not with noise but with silence. And this leads us gently to another question. If there was no final collapse, no great destruction, then what does it really mean for an empire to disappear? Is it gone because the people left, or is it still present in the ideas that continued, in the knowledge that spread quietly into other places? We will continue this journey slowly and carefully, but for now, let the question rest. How does something so strong, so organized, so quietly powerful simply fade away? As we continue gently forward, let us return to that quiet landscape, not at its beginning and not yet at its end, but somewhere in between, a moment when the empire is still alive, still functioning, but already beginning to change in ways that are almost invisible. If you were standing there, you might not notice anything unusual at first. The streets are still there. The homes still stand. People still move through their daily routines. But if you stayed a little longer, if you watched more carefully, you might begin to feel it. A slight slowing, not of time, but of movement. Where once there was a steady flow of goods, there are now small pauses. A trader arrives later than expected. Another does not arrive at all. At first, these are just small inconveniences, nothing to worry about. But over time, these small gaps begin to connect, and when they do, they form patterns. Now let us move a little deeper into the life of this empire, because to understand how it fades, we must first understand how it functioned at its peak. This was not an empire of loud rulers or visible power. It was an empire of systems, carefully built, carefully maintained. Water systems that carried life through the land. Storage systems that protected food through changing seasons. Trade systems that connected distant places. Everything depended on everything else, like a quiet web where each thread supports the others. Imagine a single storage building. At first glance, it may seem simple, just a structure holding grain or goods, but in truth, it is something much more important. It represents planning. It means that someone thought ahead, that someone understood cycles of growth and scarcity. And more importantly, it means that people trusted each other enough to store resources together. This is not something small. It is a sign of deep cooperation. Now imagine many such storage spaces across many settlements, all following similar patterns, all working in similar ways. It is almost as if there is a shared understanding, a quiet agreement spread across a wide area. No central voice, but a common idea. And this is what holds the empire together. But here is where the mystery deepens, because systems like this, while strong, are also delicate. They depend on consistency, on predictability, on the idea that tomorrow will behave somewhat like today. As time passes slowly, that predictability begins to shift. The rivers, once reliable, begin to behave differently. Some flow less. Others move in unexpected ways. Floods may come, but not at the usual times, or they may not come at all. And when water changes, everything changes. Fields begin to respond differently. Crops that once grew easily now require more effort. Yields become uncertain, not completely gone, just less stable. And this uncertainty begins to move through the system like a quiet ripple. At first, the people adapt. They have done this before. They adjust planting times. They explore new areas. They rely more on stored resources. And for a while, this works. The system bends again, but it holds. But this raises another gentle question. How many times can a system bend before it can no longer return to its original shape? Now let us shift our attention slightly, not to the land but to the people, because an empire is not just systems. It is people living within those systems, thinking, deciding, responding. Imagine a family in one of these settlements. They have lived here for generations. They know the land. They understand the rhythms of the seasons. But now, those rhythms feel different, less certain. And so they begin to consider something new, not out of fear, but out of quiet practicality. What if they moved? This is not a sudden decision. It grows slowly, a thought at first, then a discussion, then a possibility, and finally a choice. When one family leaves, it does not change much. The settlement continues, the systems remain. But when a few families leave, the balance begins to shift. There are fewer hands to work the fields, fewer people to maintain shared spaces, fewer participants in the system. And because this empire depends on cooperation, even small reductions matter. Now let us move outward again, across the wider network of settlements, because this is not happening in just one place. It is happening in many, quietly, independently, but with similar patterns. Some areas may still thrive, others begin to weaken. Trade routes become uneven. Some remain active, others grow quiet. And over time, the network begins to loosen. This is important because the strength of the empire was never in a single city, it was in the connections between them. And when those connections begin to fade, the empire itself begins to lose its shape. But this fading is not obvious. There is no single moment where someone says, the empire is ending. Instead, there are only small changes, a road less used, a building left empty, a system maintained a little less carefully. Now, let us pause again and reflect. Because what we are witnessing is something very different from the stories we often hear about history. There are no dramatic invasions here, no sudden destruction, just gradual change, quiet transformation, and this leads us to another question. If the people are leaving, where are they going? The answer is not entirely clear, but we can imagine. They move toward places where water is more reliable, where land is more stable. They carry with them their knowledge, their skills, their ways of organizing life. And so the empire does not truly disappear, it spreads. Its ideas move into new regions. Its systems are adapted, changed, reshaped. In this way, the empire continues, just not in the same form. Now let us return one more time to the cities that remain, because not all are abandoned at once. Some continue for longer, holding onto the old systems, maintaining the structures, but even here change is visible. Buildings are repaired less often. Public spaces are used differently. The sense of shared activity begins to fade. And perhaps the most telling sign is silence. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the quiet absence of what once was. Fewer voices, less movement, less connection. Over time, nature begins to return. Slowly, dust settles, plants grow where people once walked. Structures that were carefully built begin to soften at the edges. And yet, even in this fading, there is something remarkable. The order remains. The patterns are still visible. As if the empire is still there, just without its people. This brings us to a quiet realization. This empire was never about power in the traditional sense. It was about balance, about systems that worked together, about people who shared an understanding. And when that balance shifted, the empire did not collapse. It simply became something else. Now, let us move a little deeper into one final thought for this part, because there is something else that makes this story so unusual. Something that historians and thinkers still reflect on. There is very little evidence of conflict, very few signs of violence, no clear marks of war destroying these places, which leads us to a gentle but powerful question. Is it possible that one of the largest and most organized societies chose to change rather than fight, not through force, not through resistance, but through quiet movement, through adaptation? If this is true, then this empire did something very rare. It did not end in chaos. It ended in transition. And that may be why it feels so mysterious, because we are used to endings that are loud, clear, final, but this one is soft, unclear, and still unfolding in ways we may not fully understand. As time passes slowly, we will continue to explore this quiet transformation. We will look deeper into the systems, the knowledge, and the subtle traces left behind. And perhaps we will come a little closer to understanding not just how this empire vanished, but what it truly means for something to disappear. As we move gently forward, let us slow down even more, because now we are entering a part of the story that is easy to miss, not because it is hidden, but because it is quiet. If we return once again to one of these cities, not at its peak and not fully abandoned, but somewhere in between, we begin to notice something subtle, a change in rhythm. In the past, everything followed a kind of natural order: morning activity, midday work, evening rest. People moved in patterns that felt steady, almost predictable. But now those patterns begin to soften, not disappear, just become less certain. A workshop that once produced tools every day now works less often. A shared space that was once full now feels open, even during busy hours. And if you listen closely, you might notice longer pauses between sounds. This may not seem important at first, but in a system built on connection, rhythm matters. Because rhythm is what keeps everything aligned. When it begins to shift, the system begins to drift. Now let us move a little deeper into the structures themselves, because the buildings of this empire were not random. They were designed with care, streets aligned in thoughtful ways, water channels placed with precision, homes built to serve both individual and shared needs. But as time passes slowly, maintenance becomes less consistent. A small crack in a wall is not repaired immediately. A drainage channel is cleared a little less often. At first, these are small things, almost invisible, but systems like this depend on constant attention, not large effort but steady care. And when that care becomes uneven, the system begins to lose its sharpness. Now imagine rain falling on a city that once managed water perfectly. In the past, the water would flow smoothly, guided through channels, directed away from homes. But now, with small changes in maintenance, the flow is not as precise. Water collects in places it did not before. It lingers just a little longer. This may seem like a small detail, but over time, small details shape larger outcomes. Let us shift our attention again to the people. Because as the systems become less reliable, people begin to respond in quiet ways. A craftsman who once depended on regular trade begins to produce less. A farmer who once trusted the land begins to store more just in case. A family that once felt rooted begins to consider movement again. None of these actions are dramatic. They are careful, thoughtful, practical. And yet, when many people begin making small adjustments, the entire system begins to change. Now let us consider something else: communication. In a connected empire, information moves along with goods. News of changes, new ideas, shared solutions. But as trade routes become less active, communication slows. A solution discovered in one place takes longer to reach another. A warning about changing conditions may not travel far enough. And so, each settlement begins to act more independently. This is important because the strength of the empire was in shared knowledge. When that sharing slows, each part becomes more isolated, and isolation changes decisions. Now let us move outward once more, across the wider landscape. Because while some areas are slowly weakening, others may still be stable, even thriving. This creates an uneven pattern. Some regions continue as before, others begin to fade. And this unevenness makes the transformation even quieter, because there is no single clear story, no single moment of change, just many different experiences happening at the same time. Now let us pause and reflect on something deeper, because what we are seeing is not just the fading of an empire, it is the shifting of a system. A system that was once unified is becoming fragmented, not through force, but through gradual change. And this raises another quiet question. When does a connected system stop being a system? Is it when the connections weaken, or when the shared understanding begins to fade. Perhaps it is not a single moment but a slow transition, one that is difficult to see even while it is happening. Now let us return one more time to a single place, a city that has not yet been fully abandoned. There are still people here, still movement, still life. But the feeling is different, less coordinated, less shared. Public spaces that once brought people together are used less frequently. Activities that were once communal become more individual. And slowly, the idea of the collective begins to fade. This is not a collapse. It is a quiet shift in how people live. Now let us consider something even more subtle: memory. Because as people leave and systems change, memories begin to change as well. New generations grow up in different places, with different experiences, different needs. The old systems, the old ways of organizing life are not forgotten completely, but they are no longer central. They become distant. And over time, what was once normal becomes unusual. Now let us move gently into one more layer of this story, because there is something else that remains even as everything changes: the structures. Long after the systems weaken, long after the people begin to move, the physical spaces remain. Streets still follow their patterns. Buildings still stand. Water channels, though less maintained, still show their design. And these structures tell a quiet story. They show that this was not a random collection of settlements. It was something intentional, something carefully created. And even in silence, that intention is still visible. Now imagine someone arriving here long after most people have gone. They walk through the empty spaces. They see the order, the design, the patterns, and they wonder, who built this? How did they organize it so well? Why does it feel so complete even in its emptiness? And perhaps most importantly, why is no one here? These questions are the same ones we carry today, because what remains of this empire are not loud stories, not clear answers, but quiet traces. And these traces invite us not to conclude but to reflect. As time passes slowly, we will continue to follow these traces. We will look deeper into what this empire understood about balance, about cooperation, about living within a system. And perhaps we will begin to see something unexpected: that this story is not only about the past, but about patterns that appear again and again in different forms in different times. For now, let the silence remain. Let the spaces speak gently, and let the question stay with us. How does something so carefully built, so deeply connected, so quietly powerful become a memory? As we continue, let us move even more slowly now, because we are approaching something deeper than structures, deeper than systems. We are beginning to approach understanding. If we look again at what remains, not just with our eyes but with quiet attention, we begin to notice a pattern that feels almost intentional. Everything in this empire was designed to work together, not in a rigid way, but in a balanced way. Water flowed where it was needed. People lived in ways that supported one another. Resources were shared, not wasted. It is almost as if the people who built this world understood something important, something simple but powerful: that survival is not about control, it is about balance. Now this idea may feel gentle, almost obvious, but when we look at many other empires, we see something different. We see power gathered in one place. We see leaders making decisions for many. We see systems that depend on strength or force. But here, in this silent empire, we see something else. We see a system that spreads responsibility, that shares control, that depends on cooperation rather than command. And this may explain something important: why there are no great monuments to rulers, no statues of kings watching over the land, no signs of one voice directing everything, because perhaps there was no single voice. Instead, there was a shared understanding, a quiet agreement that shaped everything. Now, let us sit with this idea for a moment, because it changes how we think about what happened. If this empire was not held together by a ruler, then it could not collapse in the usual way. There was no throne to fall, no leader to defeat, which means its ending would never look like an ending. It would look like change. Now let us move a little deeper into this thought, because balance, while strong, has its own challenges. A balanced system works best when conditions remain stable, when the environment supports it, when the rhythm of life continues in familiar ways. But when those conditions shift, balance must adjust. And sometimes the adjustment is not enough. We have already seen how rivers changed, how land became less predictable. But now let us think about something more subtle: expectation. When people live within a stable system for a long time, they begin to expect that stability. They build their lives around it. They trust it. And when that stability begins to shift, even slightly, it creates uncertainty. Not fear, not panic, just quiet uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior. People begin to plan differently, to think ahead more carefully, to prepare for possibilities rather than certainties. And this is where something very interesting begins to happen. Because when many people begin to act more cautiously, the system itself begins to slow. Trade becomes more careful. Storage becomes more guarded. Movement becomes more thoughtful. Each action makes sense on its own. Each decision is reasonable. But together, they change the rhythm of the entire empire. Now let us pause again and reflect, because what we are seeing is not failure, it is adaptation. The people of this empire are not making mistakes. They are responding intelligently to changing conditions. And yet, these responses are slowly transforming the system into something new. Now let us turn our attention to another quiet detail: standardization. Across this empire, many things followed similar patterns: weights, measurements, construction styles. This suggests something remarkable: that people across large distances agreed on how things should be done, not because they were forced to, but because it worked. This kind of agreement creates efficiency. It allows trade to flow smoothly. It builds trust between distant places. But here is the quiet question: what happens to shared standards when connections weaken, when communication slows, when regions become more independent? Do those standards remain, or do they begin to shift in small, local ways? Perhaps one region adjusts slightly, another makes a different change, And over time, what was once unified becomes varied. This is not a problem on its own, but it is a sign that the shared system is becoming less shared. Now, let us move even deeper into this idea, because it helps us understand something important. The empire did not disappear because something broke. It changed because the connections that held it together became less strong. Not suddenly, not completely, just gradually, like threads in a fabric slowly loosening. Now imagine holding a piece of cloth. When all the threads are tightly connected, it feels strong, stable, but if the threads begin to loosen, the cloth does not tear immediately. It softens, it stretches, it changes shape, and eventually it is no longer what it once was. This is what happened to the silent empire. Now let us return once more to the human side of this story, because behind every system are people making choices, and as the world around them changed, those choices began to shift. Some chose to stay and adapt. Some chose to move and begin again elsewhere. Neither choice is wrong. Both are responses to the same quiet question. Where can life continue most reliably? Now, here is something gentle to consider. When people move, they do not leave everything behind. They carry knowledge, habits, ways of thinking. And so, even as the physical empire fades, its ideas continue. They spread into new places. They mix with other cultures. They evolve. In this way, the empire is not truly lost. It is transformed. Now, let us pause here, because we are arriving at a deeper realization. Perhaps the reason this empire feels so mysterious is not because it disappeared completely, but because it did not end in a way we easily recognize. There was no final moment, no clear boundary between before and after, just a long, slow transition. And transitions are difficult to see, especially when they happen quietly. As time passes slowly, we will continue to explore what this transformation means. We will look at what this empire teaches us about connection, about balance, about change. And perhaps as we move forward, we will begin to see that this quiet story is not so distant from our own world. For now, let the thought settle gently. An empire that did not fall but slowly became something else. As we continue, let us drift even further into the quiet spaces this empire has left behind. Not just the visible spaces of streets and structures, but the invisible ones, the spaces of thought, of habit, of understanding. Because when we try to understand something that left so few clear records, we must listen not only to what is present, but also to what is missing. And what is missing here is just as important as what remains. There are no loud stories of conquest, no carvings of victory, no proud declarations of power. Instead, there is restraint, a kind of quiet discipline. It is almost as if this civilization chose not to express itself through dominance, but through balance. Now, let us move gently into another layer of this story, because there is something else that makes this empire unusual: its cities. If we imagine walking through one of them again, slowly, without hurry, we begin to notice something calming. The layout feels thoughtful, not chaotic, not crowded in a confusing way. Streets often meet at clear angles, spaces are arranged with intention. There is a sense of quiet order, and this order is not only practical, it is also peaceful. It reduces confusion. It supports daily life. It creates a feeling of stability. Now consider how different this is from many other ancient cities, places where growth was fast and often unplanned, where structures were added without much coordination, where movement could feel crowded or uncertain. But here everything feels measured, as if the people who designed these spaces valued clarity. This tells us something important, that this empire did not only solve practical problems, it also shaped experience. It created environments that made life easier, quieter, more predictable. And perhaps this is why its systems lasted as long as they did. Now let us move a little deeper again, because there is another quiet detail hidden within these cities. Water. We have already touched on how important water was, but now let us look at it more closely. Water was not just used, it was guided carefully, thoughtfully. Channels were built to direct it. Drainage systems were designed to manage it. Storage methods were used to preserve it. This is not simple work. It requires understanding, planning, consistency, and perhaps most importantly, it requires shared effort. Because a water system does not belong to one person, it belongs to everyone who depends on it. Now let us pause and reflect on this. When people share responsibility for something essential, they also share a kind of connection. A connection built not on words but on action. Each person maintains their part, and together the system works. But what happens when that shared responsibility begins to weaken? Not because people stop caring, but because conditions change, because fewer people remain, because priorities shift. The system does not fail all at once, it simply becomes less precise, less consistent, and over time that difference grows. Now let us gently return to the wider landscape, because while cities show us structure, the land shows us change. We have already seen how rivers may have shifted, how the environment became less predictable, but there is another aspect to consider: time. Long periods of time where small changes accumulate. A slightly drier season repeated many times, a gradual shift in temperature, a slow movement of water sources. Each change is small, almost unnoticeable on its own, but together they reshape the world. And when the world changes, systems must change with it. Now let us think again about the people, because in the end, it is their choices that shape what happens next. As conditions shift and systems become less certain, people begin to rely more on what they know directly. Their immediate surroundings, their local resources, the wider connections while still present become less central. And this is how a large, connected system slowly becomes more local, more independent, not through division but through adaptation. Now, let us pause again and sit with a quiet realization. This empire was not destroyed. It changed scale, from large and connected to smaller and more independent, from shared systems to local ones. And in this shift, the idea of the empire itself begins to fade. Now let us move into another subtle layer: Identity. When people are part of a large system, they often share a sense of belonging, not always spoken but felt, a recognition that they are part of something larger. But when connections weaken, that sense begins to change. People begin to identify more with their immediate community, their local environment. The larger identity becomes less important, and eventually it may disappear entirely. Now this is a quiet kind of ending, not the loss of people, not the loss of knowledge, but the loss of a shared idea, the idea of being part of one connected whole. And when that idea fades, the empire as an empire no longer exists, even if the people and their knowledge continue. Now let us return one more time to the physical remains, because there is something deeply calming, almost meditative about what is left behind. The structures do not feel violent. They do not show signs of struggle. They feel still, as if they were simply left at the end of a long day. And perhaps in a way they were, not abandoned in panic, not destroyed in conflict, but slowly, gently left behind as people moved forward into new ways of living. Now let us sit with one final thought for this part. What if disappearance does not always mean loss? What if it sometimes means transformation? A movement from one form into another, a quiet continuation in a different shape. If this is true, then this silent empire did not truly vanish. It became something else, something less visible but still present. As time passes slowly, we will continue to follow this idea. We will explore what traces remain not in stone but in patterns, in habits, in ways of thinking. And perhaps we will begin to understand that some parts of this empire may still exist even now. For now, let the silence remain gentle. Let the questions rest softly. And let the story continue without hurry. As we continue, let us slow down even more until the story almost feels like stillness. Because now, we are no longer just observing what happened. We are beginning to feel how it happened. If you imagine yourself walking through one of these places, long after most people have gone, there is something unusual in the air. Not emptiness, not completely, but a kind of quiet presence. The streets are still there, holding their shape. The walls still stand, though softened by time. The pathways still guide your steps, even without voices around you. It feels as if the place remembers, not in words, but in structure. And this is where the story becomes something deeper, because memory does not only exist in people. Sometimes it exists in patterns. The way a street turns, the way a space opens, the way water once moved, all of these are forms of memory. And even when the people are gone, these patterns remain. Now let us sit with that thought for a moment, because it changes how we understand disappearance. If something leaves behind its patterns, has it truly vanished? Or has it simply become quieter? Now, let us move gently into another layer. Because there is something else that continues, even when the physical places are left behind. Knowledge, not written clearly, not stored in obvious ways, but carried slowly through people. We have already imagined families moving away, settling in new places, beginning again. But when they move, they do not become entirely new. They carry habits, ways of building, ways of organizing life. And these habits begin to appear in new environments. Perhaps a certain way of arranging a home, a familiar method of managing water, a quiet understanding of how to share resources. These are not always recognized as coming from somewhere else. They simply feel natural, and over time they blend with other ideas, other practices, creating something new. This is how influence continues without being clearly seen. Now, let us pause again and reflect. Because this kind of continuation is very different from what we usually expect, we often look for clear lines, clear beginnings and endings. But here, there are no sharp edges, only gradual change. Now let us move a little deeper into the idea of time, because time in this story does not move quickly, it stretches. Changes that take place here may unfold over generations. A person may not notice the full change in their lifetime. They may only feel that things are slightly different from how they were before, and their children may feel something else, and their children something further still, until one day, what once was feels distant, not lost completely, but no longer familiar. Now let us consider something gentle. If no single person experiences the full transition, then no one sees the empire truly end. There is no moment to remember, no event to record, and this may be why the silence remains, because silence often comes not from absence but from gradual change. Now, let us return once more to the physical world, because even though the empire fades, the land continues. The rivers still move, though differently. The seasons still pass, though with subtle shifts. Nature does not stop, it simply adjusts, and over time it begins to reclaim the spaces once shaped by people. Not in a sudden way, but slowly. Dusk gathers, plants begin to grow in quiet corners, edges soften, and the line between what was built and what is natural begins to blur. Now imagine returning to this place many generations later. The structures are still there, but less defined. The patterns still exist, but harder to see. And without the knowledge of what once was, it becomes difficult to understand. This is how mystery forms, not because something was hidden, but because it changed slowly until it became unfamiliar. Now let us move into another quiet thought, because there is something deeply human in this story. The desire to build something lasting, something stable, something that feels permanent. And in many ways, this empire achieved that. It created systems that worked, spaces that supported life, connections that brought people together. But even these could not remain unchanged forever, not because they failed, but because the world around them changed. Now let us pause again, because this is a gentle but important realization. Even the most balanced systems exist within larger forces, forces of environment, of time, of change. And no system, no matter how thoughtful, can remain exactly the same forever. Now let us return to the question that has been quietly with us since the beginning. How does something so strong, so organized, so quietly powerful disappear? Perhaps the answer is not what we expected. Perhaps it does not disappear in the way we imagine. Perhaps it changes, it loosens, it spreads, it transforms, until it is no longer what it once was but still present in different forms. Now let us sit with that idea gently, because it invites us to see history differently, not as a series of endings, but as a series of transformations. Now, as time passes slowly, we will continue to follow this quiet thread. We will look deeper into what this transformation left behind, not only in places but in ways of thinking. And perhaps as we move forward, we will begin to notice something familiar, patterns that feel not entirely distant. For now, let the stillness remain. Let the story breathe softly. And let the quiet mystery continue without needing to be solved all at once. As we continue, let us drift even deeper into this quiet unfolding, because now we begin to notice something that is easy to overlook, not what the empire lost, but what it may have understood. If we sit with the remains not as ruins, but as messages, we begin to sense a kind of thinking, a way of seeing the world, not written in words, but expressed through choices. The choice to build cities in balance with water. The choice to organize space in calm, predictable ways. The choice to avoid extremes of crowding, of control, of display. These are not accidental, they suggest intention. And that intention feels quiet, not focused on power, not focused on being remembered, but focused on living well within limits. Now let us pause with that thought, because it is different from how many societies think. Often we see a desire to expand, to grow larger, to become more visible. But here, the growth feels measured, almost careful, as if the people understood something simple, that growing too fast or too far can create imbalance. Now let us move gently into another layer, because if this empire valued balance so deeply, then its response to change would also reflect that value. When the environment shifted, when systems became less stable, it did not respond with force. It responded with adjustment. People moved. Systems adapted. Connections loosened without breaking suddenly. This is a very different kind of strength, not the strength of resistance, but the strength of flexibility. Now let us consider something quiet but powerful. In many stories of history, we admire what lasts the longest. But here, perhaps the true achievement is not how long the empire remained unchanged, but how gently it changed, without violence, without sudden collapse, just a slow, thoughtful transition. Now, let us move a little deeper into the human experience again. Imagine being part of this world during its later stages. You may not feel like you are living in a falling empire. You may simply feel that life is shifting. Some things are less certain. Some patterns are changing, but daily life continues. You still wake up. You still work. You still connect with those around you. And when change becomes steady, even if it is slow, it begins to feel normal. Now let us pause again, because this tells us something important. The people who lived through this transformation did not experience it as a dramatic ending. They experienced it as life continuing. Now let us move outward once more, because over time, as people settled into new places, their ways of living continued to evolve. Some ideas remained, others changed. Some were forgotten, but traces always remained. And these traces are what we see today. Not a complete picture, but fragments, pieces of a larger whole. Now let us gently explore one of the most interesting parts of this mystery. Why does this empire feel so modern in some ways? When we look at its organization, its focus on systems, its balance between people and environment, it feels familiar, as if it understood ideas that we still value today. Ideas like sustainability, like shared responsibility, like thoughtful design. And this raises a quiet question. Were these ideas lost and rediscovered later? Or have they always been present, appearing again and again in different forms? Now let us sit with that, because it connects the past to the present. It suggests that what we are seeing is not just a distant story, but a pattern of how humans learn, adapt, and reorganize. Now let us move into another gentle realization. If this empire continues in small ways, through ideas, through habits, through patterns, then its disappearance is not complete. It is partial, visible in some ways, hidden in others. And this may be why it feels so quiet, because it is not entirely gone. It is simply less visible. Now let us return one more time to the feeling of the place, the stillness, the calm. It does not feel like an ending filled with loss. It feels like a pause, a space between what was and what came next. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand it. Not as a failure, not as a mystery to be solved completely, but as a transition to be gently observed. Now, as time passes slowly, we will continue this quiet journey. We will explore what this story leaves behind, not only in history, but in how we think about the world. And perhaps we will begin to see something unexpected, that the silent empire is not only behind us, but in some ways still unfolding. For now, let the thought rest softly. Let the patterns remain gentle, and let the story continue without needing an end. As we continue, let us move into an even quieter space. A space where the story becomes less about what we can see and more about what we can feel. Because by now, the empire, as it once was, is no longer fully present. Its cities are quieter, its systems are softer, its connections more distant. And yet something remains, not in the form of power, not in the form of structure alone, but in a kind of lingering presence. If you imagine walking slowly through one of these places again, you may begin to notice how naturally everything is arranged. Even in its faded state, it still makes sense. The streets still guide you. The spaces still feel usable. The layout still feels intentional. It is as if the design itself continues to function even without the people who created it. Now let us pause with that thought, because it suggests something very gentle but very meaningful. That the people who built this world understood how to create systems that could outlast them, not through strength, not through control, but through simplicity. Now let us move a little deeper into this idea. Simple systems are often the most lasting, because they do not depend on constant correction. They do not require strict control. They allow for variation, for small changes, for adaptation. And this may explain why so much of this empire still feels clear, even after it has faded. Now let us shift our attention slightly to something we have only touched on before: silence. Not just the silence of empty places, but the silence of history itself. Because when we look back at this empire, we do not find long written records. We do not find detailed explanations. We find very little direct voice. And this creates a different kind of relationship with the past. Instead of being told what happened, we are invited to observe, to interpret, to feel. And in this way, the silence becomes part of the story. It allows space, space for thought, space for reflection. Now let us consider something else. If this empire had left behind loud, detailed records, we might see it differently. We might focus on specific events, specific people, specific decisions. But because it did not, we are guided towards something else. Patterns, the way things were built, the way systems were organized, the way change unfolded. And these patterns tell a different kind of story, a story that is less about moments and more about processes. Now let us move gently into another layer. Because there is something deeply calming about this kind of history. There is no rush, no sudden turning point, just a slow unfolding. And perhaps this is why the story feels so suited to quiet reflection, because it mirrors something we all experience: gradual change, the kind of change that happens so slowly we only notice it when we look back. Now let us pause again, because this brings us to a deeper understanding. The Silent Empire is not only a story of the past, it is also a way of seeing change, a reminder that not everything ends with a clear moment. Some things simply become different. Now let us return one more time to the people who lived through this, because even though their voices are quiet, their presence is still felt in the careful planning of their spaces, in the balance of their systems, in the absence of unnecessary excess. They were thoughtful, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a steady, consistent way. And this kind of thoughtfulness leaves a different kind of mark, not one that demands attention, but one that endures quietly. Now let us move into one more gentle reflection for this part. What if the reason this empire feels so mysterious is not because it disappeared, but because it does not fit the patterns we expect? We expect rise and fall. We expect conflict and resolution. But here we find something else: continuity through change. A system that did not break but slowly transformed until it was no longer recognized as the same thing. Now, as time passes slowly, we will continue to follow this quiet thread. We will explore how these patterns echo beyond this place into other times, other societies, even into our present. And perhaps we will begin to notice something very subtle: that the story we are telling is not only about something that vanished, but about something that continues quietly in many forms. For now, let the stillness remain. Let the silence feel complete, rather than empty, and let the story continue without needing to be finished. As we continue, let us move into the quietest layer of all, a place where the story is no longer only about an empire, but about a way of being. By now, the cities have softened into the landscape. The systems have loosened into memory. The connections have thinned into faint traces. And yet, something feels strangely complete, not in a perfect way, but in a natural way. As if what we are witnessing is not an unfinished story, but a story that followed its course all the way through. Now let us sit with that idea, because it gently changes how we understand everything that came before. We began with a question. How does something so large, so organized, simply disappear? But perhaps that question came from an assumption that disappearance is something unnatural, something that should not happen. But what if, in some cases, it is part of the design? Not planned in detail, not decided in advance, but accepted as part of the natural movement of things. Now let us move a little deeper into this thought. Everything we have seen in this empire points toward balance, not pushing too far, not holding too tightly. And if that is true, then perhaps even its ending followed the same principle. When conditions changed, it did not resist beyond its limits. It adjusted, it spread, it softened, until it was no longer the same shape, but still in harmony with what came next. Now let us pause again, because this is a very quiet kind of wisdom. The idea that not everything must be held together forever, that sometimes continuity exists not in holding form but in allowing form to change. Now let us return once more to the people, not as a groupie but as individuals, each person living their life, making small decisions, responding to their world, none of them seeing the full picture. None of them knowing they are part of something that will one day feel mysterious. And yet, together, their choices shaped everything. Now let us reflect on that. History is often told through great figures, great events, clear turning points, but here we see something else. A history shaped by ordinary actions, planting crops, maintaining spaces, choosing when to stay and when to move. And over time, these small actions become something vast. Now, let us move into one more gentle realization. If this empire continues through patterns, through ideas, through quiet influence, then perhaps its true legacy is not what it built, but how it lived. A way of organizing life that valued balance, that avoided extremes, that allowed change without collapse. Now let us sit with that softly, because it brings us back to the present in a very subtle way. We too live within systems. We too depend on connections. We too respond to changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes without noticing. And just like this silent empire, our world is shaped not only by large events, but by countless small decisions. Now let us pause, because this is not a warning, not a lesson to be forced, just a quiet reflection, that what seems stable may always be gently shifting, and what seems to disappear may simply be transforming. Now, as we rest in this final layer of the story for now, we do not need to reach a sharp conclusion. We do not need to solve every mystery, because some stories are not meant to end clearly. They are meant to be felt, to be carried quietly as a way of seeing. And so the silent empire remains with us, not as a place we can fully return to, but as a pattern we can gently recognize. A reminder that even the largest systems can move softly into something new. For now, let the story rest. Let the thoughts settle slowly. and let the quiet presence of this ancient world fade gently into stillness. As we continue, let us not rush toward an ending. Instead, let us remain here a little longer in this quiet space where the story has softened. Because even now, there are still gentle threads we can follow, threads that do not lead to conclusions but to deeper understanding. If we return once more not to the empire at its height, but to its final, quiet phase, we begin to notice something very subtle. Life did not stop. Even as cities thinned, even as systems loosened, people still lived. They still woke with the morning light. They still prepared food. They still spoke, shared, rested. And in this there is something important, because from the outside we might call this the end of an empire. But from the inside it simply felt like life continuing. Now let us sit with that difference. The difference between how something looks and how it feels to those within it. To us, looking back, it appears as a mystery, a disappearance. But to them, it was a series of ordinary days gently changing over time. Now let us move a little deeper into this feeling. Imagine a person living in one of the later settlements. They may remember stories of how things once were, how trade was more active, how the city felt fuller, how connections reached farther, but those memories would not feel like loss in a dramatic sense. They would feel like distance, like remembering a season that has passed, familiar but no longer present. And so, their focus would not be on what was gone, but on what remained. Their family, their land, their daily rhythm. And this is how transition continues quietly, not through sudden change, but through shifting attention. Now let us pause again, because this shows us something very gentle about human nature. We adapt not all at once, but moment by moment. And in doing so, we often move forward without needing a clear ending behind us. Now let us return once more to the idea of connection. Even as large networks faded, smaller connections remained strong. Families, neighbors, local communities. And in many ways, these smaller connections may have become even more important. Because when large systems weaken, local relationships carry more weight. They provide stability, support, continuity. And so, while the empire as a whole faded, life at the smaller scale may have remained steady. Now let us move gently into another layer, because there is something quietly beautiful in this kind of transition. Nothing is forced. Nothing is broken suddenly. Instead, everything shifts at a pace that allows adjustment. People have time to respond, to move, to rethink. And this slow pace reduces shock. It allows life to continue even as structures change. Now let us reflect on that, because it offers a different image of change. Not as something harsh or sudden, but as something gradual and absorbable. Now let us turn once more to what remains today. The traces, the patterns, the quiet evidence. They do not tell us everything, but they tell us enough to sense the shape of what once was. A society that valued order but not control, connection but not domination, stability but not rigidity, and perhaps most importantly, a society that allowed itself to change. Now let us pause again and let that settle, because this may be the most unusual part of the entire story. Not that the empire disappeared, but that it did so without resistance that left scars, without a final moment that demanded attention. Just a long, quiet transition into something else. Now, as we remain in this gentle space, there is no need to close the story completely, because in a way it is still open, still unfolding through the questions it leaves behind, through the patterns it reveals, through the way it changes how we see history itself. So for now, we simply stay here a little longer, with the stillness, with the quiet, with the understanding that not all endings are meant to be seen, and that sometimes the most powerful changes are the ones that happen softly. As we continue, let us remain in this calm space a little longer. No need to move quickly, no need to search for a final answer, because sometimes understanding does not come from reaching the end but from staying with the feeling. If we return once more to that quiet landscape, we may begin to notice something we have not fully explored yet. Not the presence of the empire, but its absence, and how gentle that absence feels. There is no sense of interruption, no feeling that something was suddenly taken away. Instead, it feels as though the space simply opened. The buildings remain, but they no longer define the place. The streets remain, but they no longer guide a crowd. The systems remain, but they are no longer active. And yet, nothing feels broken. This is a very different kind of emptiness. It is not emptiness as loss. It is emptiness as release. Now let us sit with that idea, because it is not something we often consider. We usually think of the end of something large as something dramatic, something that leaves a mark, but here the mark is soft, almost like a footprint in sand slowly fading as the wind passes over it. Now let us move gently into another layer, because there is something else that happens when a system fades this way. It leaves space for something new, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. As people settle into new places, as new patterns form, as different ideas come together, a new kind of order begins to appear, not identical to the old one, but shaped by it, influenced by what came before. Now let us pause again, because this is where the story becomes part of a larger cycle, not just one empire, but many. Across time, across different places, we see similar movements. Systems form, they grow, they reach balance, and then slowly they change, not always through collapse, but often through transformation. Now let us consider something very quiet. If this pattern repeats, then perhaps what we are seeing is not unusual at all. Perhaps it is simply a natural rhythm, a rhythm of building, balancing, and becoming something new. Now let us return one more time to the people, because even as large patterns unfold, life is always lived in small moments. A conversation between two people, a shared meal, a quiet evening. These moments continue regardless of larger change. And in many ways, they are what truly carry life forward. Now let us reflect gently. The empire in its grand form fades, but life in its simple form continues. And perhaps that is what matters most. Not the size of the system, but the continuity of living. Now, as we sit with this thought, we begin to feel a kind of calm understanding. that not everything needs to remain as it is to still have meaning, that something can change completely and still leave behind something valuable. Now, let us move into one more quiet realization. If we look carefully, we may begin to notice that this story has slowly shifted. At the beginning, we were asking, how did this empire disappear? But now the question feels different. Now we might ask, what did this empire become? And that question does not have a single answer, because the answer is spread across time, across places, across people. It exists in fragments, in influences, in patterns that continue quietly. Now let us pause here, because this is not a place for conclusions. It is a place for reflection, a place where the story does not close but softens. And so we remain here, with the fading light of an ancient world, with the gentle sense of something that once was, with the quiet understanding that it did not vanish completely, it simply changed. And in that change it became something that no longer needs to be seen clearly to still be felt. For now, let the story rest here softly, not ended, not resolved, just present. As we continue, let us remain here in this soft, almost weightless part of the story. Nothing is rushing forward now. Nothing is demanding attention, because what we are exploring is not an ending, it is a quiet after. If you imagine the world long after the empire has faded, you might begin to notice how completely the land has settled. The sharp edges of structures have softened. The clear lines of streets have blurred. The spaces that were once full now feel open and still. And yet, there is no sense of emptiness that feels uncomfortable. Instead, there is calm, a calm that comes when something has completed its time. Now let us sit with that feeling, because it is different from loss. Loss often feels sudden. It carries weight, but this feels light, as if the story gently placed itself down and stepped away. Now let us move a little deeper into this quiet space, because there is something else that happens when time passes this slowly. The need to remember begins to fade. Not completely, but gradually. Stories that were once clear become softer, details become less important. What remains is only the feeling, a sense that something existed, something meaningful, but without the sharp edges of exact memory. Now let us pause again, because this tells us something important about how the past lives on, not always through precise detail, but through atmosphere, through a kind of quiet impression that stays, even when the facts are no longer clear. Now let us imagine someone far removed from this time. They walk through the remains without knowing the full story. They see the patterns, they notice the order, and they feel something. A sense that this place was once alive in a thoughtful way, but they cannot fully explain it. And perhaps they do not need to, because not all understanding comes from explanation. Some of it comes from presence. Now let us move gently into another reflection, because there is something deeply human in this kind of fading. We often hold on to things, moments, places, ways of life. We try to preserve them, to keep them as they are, but time does not move that way. It carries everything forward, slowly, continuously, and sometimes the most natural thing is not to hold on but to allow change. Now let us sit with that thought, because it connects us to the story in a very quiet way. Just like this empire, our own lives are filled with small transitions, things that once felt permanent, slowly becoming something else, not disappearing suddenly, but shifting gently over time. Now let us return one more time to the landscape. There is almost no movement now, only the slow passing of wind, the quiet presence of earth and sky. And within this stillness the story remains, not in words, not in clear images, but in a feeling of balance once held, a feeling of connection once shared. And perhaps that is enough. Now, as we remain in this calm space, there is no need to reach forward, no need to ask what comes next, because the story has already shown us what it needed to, not through a single moment, but through a long, gentle unfolding. And so we simply stay here, letting the silence feel complete, letting the past rest without disturbance, letting the mind drift without needing to solve anything. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. As we continue, let us stay here just a little longer, in this soft, quiet stillness where nothing needs to change. By now, the story has become very light, almost like a memory you can feel but not fully hold. And yet there is still something here, something gentle that has not quite faded. If we listen closely, not with effort but with calm attention, we may notice a final, subtle presence, not of the empire itself, but of what it understood. Because even though the structures have softened, even though the systems have loosened, the idea behind them still feels clear, a way of living that did not rush, that did not push beyond its limits, that allowed space for balance. Now let us sit with that one last time, because it is easy to overlook. The world we often imagine is loud, filled with sharp moments, clear rises and falls, but this story has been something else, a quiet unfolding, a reminder that not all strength is visible, not all endings are final. Now, let us move gently into one more reflection. If this empire had ended in a dramatic way, it might be easier to remember. There would be stories, clear events, but because it ended softly, it leaves us with something different. Not answers, but understanding, an understanding that grows slowly. Now let us pause, because this is where the story becomes something we carry rather than something we conclude. We carry the feeling of balance, the sense of quiet connection, the idea that change can happen without breaking everything. And perhaps that is the true legacy. Not something we can point to, but something we can recognize when we see it again. Now, as the story settles even further, there is very little left to say. Only a quiet awareness that something once existed and that it changed gently into something else. No sudden ending, no final moment, just a soft transition into stillness. And so we remain here for a moment longer, letting the silence feel complete, letting the thoughts slow down, letting the story rest. Because not every journey needs a clear destination. Sometimes it is enough to have walked slowly and noticed what was there. And now very gently we begin to let even this fade, not as an ending, but as a quiet continuation into rest. As we continue, there is almost nothing left to follow, and yet something still gently remains. Not a new part of the story, but an echo, a soft echo of everything we have slowly moved through. If you sit with it now, without trying to think too clearly, you may notice how the story no longer feels like something outside of you. It feels closer, not because you have learned every detail, but because you have felt its rhythm, the slow growth, the quiet balance, the gentle change, and now the stillness. This is where the story becomes very simple. An empire rose not loudly but carefully. It connected people not through force but through shared understanding. It created balance not by control but through cooperation. And when the world around it shifted, it did not break, it adjusted, it softened, it slowly became something else. And in that becoming, it left behind no sharp ending, only a quiet space where it once was. Now let us pause here, because this space, this calm, open space, is not empty. It is full of everything that came before, but in a softer form, just like a memory that no longer needs detail to still be real. Now let us take one more gentle step back, far enough that the entire story feels distant, not lost, just settled. From here, it no longer feels like a mystery to solve. It feels like something to accept, that not everything leaves a clear trace, that not everything needs a final moment. Some things simply move from presence into quiet, and that quiet is not an absence. It is a different kind of presence. Now, as we remain in this last, calm layer, there is nothing more to uncover, nothing more to explain, only a gentle awareness that the story has reached its natural stillness. And so, very softly, we allow it to rest. No conclusion, no final answer, just a quiet understanding that something once existed and that it changed in the most peaceful way possible. And now we let even that thought drift gently away. As we continue, there is almost nothing left to say. And yet, we can remain here just a little longer, because sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that stay with us the most. The story has already softened. The shapes have already faded. The questions have already become gentle. And now, what remains is not the empire, but the feeling it left behind. A feeling of slow time, of steady balance, of change that does not rush. If you notice your thoughts now, they may feel slower, less focused on answers, more open, more relaxed. This is where the story has been leading all along, not toward a dramatic ending, but toward this calm. Now let us rest in it. No need to imagine cities anymore. No need to follow the paths or the rivers. Just a quiet space. A space where everything has already unfolded and nothing more needs to happen. If a thought appears, let it pass. If a question forms, let it soften. There is nothing to solve here, only a gentle awareness that everything has moved exactly as it needed to. And just like the empire, your thoughts can also become quieter, looser, less defined. Now, as we remain in this stillness, even the idea of the story begins to fade, not disappearing completely, but becoming lighter, like something drifting further away without effort, and in its place there is only calm, a steady, quiet calm that does not need to change. So for now, we simply stay here. No beginning, no end, just rest. As we continue, there is almost nothing left to follow, and that is perfectly all right, because now we are no longer moving through a story. We are resting inside it. Everything that needed to unfold has already done so. The cities have quieted. The paths have softened. The questions have settled. And what remains is something very simple: stillness. Not empty, not lacking, just still. If you notice your breathing now, it may feel slower, more even, as if it has gently matched the pace of everything we have explored. There is no need to think about the past anymore. No need to imagine the empire or what it became, because all of that has already passed softly into this calm. Now we let even the last shapes fade. The outlines of buildings gone. The sense of movement gone. Only a quiet presence remains. And even that begins to soften, like a distant memory becoming lighter until it no longer needs to be held. There is nothing to do here, nothing to understand, only rest. If a thought appears, let it drift. If an image forms, let it fade. Everything is allowed to slow and soften, just as the empire once did, and just as the story has done. Now we remain here for a final gentle moment in complete calm, and then very quietly we let go. No ending, no closing words, only silence and rest. As we continue, there is almost nothing left to carry forward, only a soft, quiet presence that lingers for a moment longer. The story has already dissolved into stillness. And now, even that stillness begins to feel lighter, not fading away completely, but becoming so gentle that it no longer asks for attention. If you notice your thoughts now, they may feel distant, like something far away across a quiet landscape. There is no need to follow them, no need to hold onto anything. Everything can simply pass. Just as time passed over the empire, just as everything slowly found its place. Now even the feeling of the story becomes softer. No more images, no more questions, only a calm, steady quiet, a quiet that does not need words. And as we rest here, there is nothing left to add, nothing left to explain. Only this gentle space where everything has already settled. So we remain for one last quiet moment. And then even this drifts as we continue. There is nothing left to follow, and that too feels gentle. Everything has already become quiet. The story, the images, the thoughts all have softened into something light. There is no movement now, no direction, only a calm space that simply exists. If anything appears in your mind, it comes slowly and leaves just as softly. There is no need to hold it. Everything is allowed to pass like a slow breeze moving across still water. Now even the idea of continuing begins to fade, because there is nowhere left to go, only rest. A deep, steady rest where nothing needs to be added and nothing needs to be taken away. And so very gently everything settles into silence, into calm, into stillness. As we continue, even the sense of continuing begins to soften until it no longer feels like movement at all. There is no path now, no story to follow, only a quiet presence resting exactly where it is. The mind becomes still, not forced, not controlled, just naturally slowing, like water that has stopped moving becoming smooth again. Nothing needs to be remembered, nothing needs to be imagined, everything has already settled into its quiet place. If a thought appears, it drifts by gently without staying. If a feeling rises, it softens on its own. There is no effort here, only rest. A calm, steady rest that asks for nothing. And in this space, even the idea of words begins to fade. So we remain without speaking, without thinking, just resting in quiet stillness. As we continue, there is only the quiet now, soft, steady, and undisturbed. Nothing is moving forward, nothing is being held back, everything simply is. The mind rests without effort. Thoughts come and go like distant echoes, never staying long enough to form anything heavy. There is no story left to follow, no images to return to, only a gentle sense of calm, spreading wider, becoming lighter. Until even that feeling begins to fade into something even softer, a space without shape, without direction, just stillness. If you notice anything at all, it is quiet, and even that quiet does not need to be noticed. There is nothing to do here, nothing to reach for, only rest. A deep, peaceful rest where everything has already settled. And so we remain without movement, without thought, just resting in complete stillness. As we continue, even the sense of quiet begins to dissolve, becoming so soft that it no longer feels like something you are noticing. There is no effort now, no awareness that needs to hold anything in place. Everything has already settled deeper than before. The mind is no longer following thoughts. It is no longer waiting. It is simply resting. Like a still night with no wind, no sound, no movement at all. There is nothing to add, nothing to remove. Only this gentle, endless calm. Even the idea of resting fades, until there are no words left to describe it. No story, no time, just a quiet presence that does not ask to be understood. And so very softly we remain here without thought, without direction, completely at rest. And now very gently we allow this long, quiet journey to come to rest. For a long while, we have wandered through something that no longer exists, yet somehow never truly disappeared. We began with a question, a quiet mystery, about an empire that left behind no clear ending. And slowly, without rushing, we followed its presence through patterns, through silence, through the soft traces it left behind. But in the end, we did not find a dramatic answer. We found something calmer. We found that not all things are meant to end loudly. Some things simply change. They loosen, they soften, they become something else, so gradually that no single moment can be called the end. And perhaps that is not a loss. Perhaps it is a different kind of continuation. Because even now, though the empire is gone, its quiet understanding still lingers in the idea of balance, in the rhythm of slow change, in the gentle way things can fade without breaking. And maybe in a small way that understanding has now become part of you, not as a clear memory but as a feeling. A feeling that something can exist, serve its time, and then peacefully become something new. Now there is nothing left to follow, no more questions to carry. Only a calm space where everything has already settled. So as this story finally comes to its quiet close, you don't need to hold on to it. You can let it drift just as the empire once did, slowly, gently, without effort. Let the thoughts soften. Let the images fade. Let the mind grow still. And in that stillness rest, because the story is complete, and there is nothing left to do except sleep.